frequency range of what you were listening to, depending on what conditions you were listening to. Because most stethoscopes, I don't know how much they've advanced now. This was about 30 years ago. But at the time, it was about an interface to a physical instrument. Yeah.
So I've known you for 30 years, and I've never heard that before. But so Mike has spoken to this group many times, and he's always urged us to think expansively about what we mean by cognitive science and the sorts of theories and methods we bring to the table to study learning. Well, today he's going one step further, and he's going to urge us to think expansively about what it means to be human and the future of human augmentation. So with that, let's start.
Thank you so much, Tammy. So for those of you who don't know the kind of work that I do, I just wanted to give a sort of introductory slide. My wife Anne and I, Anne's here, we together co-direct a lab called the Craft Technology Lab here at CU. It's over in the Fleming building in the Idea Forge space. And our abiding interests have been in science and mathematics education. The kind of work that we do specifically tries to blend what we see as the best, most powerful traditions of children's crafts and construction, the best educational traditions of children's crafts, with the affordances and power of novel technologies. So that takes a variety of forms. Sometimes we work on designing software that can be used with new kinds of fabrication devices, like 3D printers. There's a 3D printed knot at the bottom left there. Or even with what our first project involved, a kind of then new but now traditional fabrication device, output device of a color printer, inkjet color printer. So those are paper polyhedral sculptures of penguins in the upper left. Sometimes this takes the form, our work takes the form of blending computational tools with construction materials. So at the center there is our former doctoral student, Leah Beakley, with her programmable shirt. Leah was the inventor of the LilyPad Arduino, which is now one of the more popular platforms for doing e-textiles. And the idea is that you could sew computers and sensors and actuators and all kinds of things onto clothing and connect them via conductive wire, and then you can run programs on textile surfaces, including your clothing. That's her with a shirt that actually plays Conway's Game of Life, for those CS students who remember that. It's a cellular automaton. So you can run a cellular automaton program right there on your shirt. Our current student, Hyunju Oh, is working on a project called Paper Mechatronics, in which you can use novel technologies like paper cutters and laser cutters and so forth to cut high-precision pieces of paper, which you can then attach computational elements to, and you can make working paper machines. I would love to spend the whole time talking about that, but this talk is about something else. And then we've worked on other kinds of projects involving the creation of new sorts of input hardware or the use of new surfaces, like the giant spherical screen that they have over at the Fisk Planetarium or at NOAA, a variety of museums. So we designed a programming language that would allow kids to create spherical patterns, learn some non-Euclidean geometry in the process, and actually display these patterns on a huge spherical screen. So that gives you a sense of the kinds of things that we do. We're especially interested in creating systems, or the way I would think about it is that what we try to do is we try to design activities for children. We're not so concerned with the language, for example, of skills or curricula. We try to find ways in which kids can spend time productively and creatively. And that's a theme that runs through a lot of the work that we do. So I begin with that just so that you know kind of the background that with which I came to the subject that I'm going to talk about here. This has been a extremely, I don't know if I want to say troubling, or I've been thinking a lot about this subject over the past couple of years. And I'll describe to you what it is, and with a great deal of ambivalence. Ambivalence here is not a euphemism for negative feelings. I really feel a great excitement and sense of intrigue and joy about a lot of the technologies that I'm going to speak about. At the same time that there are a lot of reasons for trepidation. So let me begin with an example. This is actually a commercial product now, but the passage that I've got here is from a book from about 3 years ago, 3 years ago, by Cara Platoni, called We Have the Technology. And it's a book about research into the senses. And in the major chapter in the book, she meets with and talks to a group of, they go by different names, they call themselves body modders. And they're interested in using new kinds of technology to to extend the limitations of their bodies. In this case, the limitations of their senses. The first, almost sort of the gateway activity of this little community of young people is to insert magnets in their fingers. So they have magnets inserted in their fingers, and then in a sense, there's much to discuss here, but they can feel magnetic fields around them. To their surprise, initially, they could also feel things like alternating current and stuff like that because of the associated magnetic fields. At the time that Platoni wrote about this was a kind of hobbyist activity. I'll just read this. They have great faith in humanity's ability, they being the body modders, have great faith in humanity's ability to engineer its way out of biological problems. Perhaps they can cobble together a sensory device that will let them peer into the universe of information that is passing them by. So they uncurl themselves from around the coffee table and head down into the basement to see what they can make next. It's a very interesting discussion, and I want to follow up on two themes from this. First, the kinds of technology that these people are looking at and working with. So the one theme to follow up on is the kinds of sensory or actuation or cognitive enhancements or extensions that people in this community are looking at. The second is actually suggested by that last sentence, interestingly enough. This is it's not just that these people are interested in experimenting with technology. There's a kind of social or cultural movement involved here that I think is extraordinarily important for the future of children's technology. The kinds of technology that I'm going to talk about are actually, there's a constellation of these things. And at this point, most of the work is sufficiently embryonic so that many of these topics are linked together in discussion. Over time, undoubtedly, they'll begin to separate out. But in a way, the early perspective is not so inaccurate because these technologies, although they will separate out in areas of expertise over time, no question, at the same time, they work as part of an ecosystem with each other and with existing technologies. Here's the kinds of things that I have in mind. These are all representative books that discuss a variety of these technologies. But let me just mention, sort of the prominent examples. One has to do with the kinds of things that those body modders were working on, sensory enhancement, designing new extended ways of sensing the outside world. This could take a variety of forms. The kinds of things that those young people in Platoni's book are doing is a very early form. They get magnets inserted in their fingers. By the way, I should mention that They don't go to doctors for doing this, MDs. They go to tattoo artists. And there is a whole kind of subculture of people who do this kind of work. There is a certain history to this work. The main idea, I mean, there are a number of main ideas, but the theme that runs through a lot of this is designing tools that allow people to interpret signals from the outside world in novel ways. This began as a kind of restorative therapy with Paul Bacchi-Rita's work in the 1970s. This amazing work, he designed a chair, it was based on kind of a dentist chair, for people who were, I think, blind since birth. And in the back of the chair, there was an array of tactile stimulation, like little pegs, that in effect made for a kind of low-res representation of the scene as viewed by a camera sitting above the chair. So somebody sitting in the chair would have a camera above them that was looking at the scene in front of them, and they would feel stimulation on their back depending on what was in front of the camera. People who had been blind since birth, who sat in this chair, reported having what they described as kind of visual experience. That is, if something was looming in front of them, they would duck away from it. So this is a very interesting example of how the brain can be a transducer of signals. You can take in the sort of given the right presentation mode, and the boundaries of that are still very much an empirical question, but given the right presentation mode, it's certainly possible to receive signals from the outside world via all kinds of input devices. At the right here is the cognitive scientist David Eagleman. This is a scene from his TED talk where he showed a vest that he had designed that had a similar intent to use tactile stimulation to translate auditory signals. And so it's used for people who are hearing impaired, and they can wear this vest and they just get signals which over time they learn to interpret as sounds and words. He gives a rather spectacular demonstration of the vest in his TED talk. But we've seen other kinds of things like cochlear implants, and these are interface devices made by Dexta Robotics. They make sort of devices for the hands that allow you to get a sort of haptic feel or texture of objects on the screen. In other words, these are things that can be worn, handled, implanted to enhance sensory perception. Similarly, there are technologies to enhance actuation, to enhance performance of one kind or another. These include things like robotic exoskeletons. There's one that's shown at the left there, which is part of a project to design suits for people to be able to lift heavy weights, for instance, in construction work that they would be unable to do before. At the upper center there is the performance artist Stellark from Australia. He's a very strange fellow, and you could watch his own TED talk. I showed it to my students yesterday in class, and we were all a little freaked. But anyway, he does. But he's done a variety of projects, including making an additional robotic arm and hand for himself. You see him wearing it in that shot. It's controlled by muscle twitches in his stomach, and he got sufficiently practiced and fluent, you could say, with the hand so that he could write his name with it and do a variety of complex tasks. So he was, in effect, he was able to work with 3 arms for a variety of different purposes. The man in the bottom center photograph is the prosthetics engineer Hugh Hare at the MIT Media Lab. He unfortunately lost both his legs in a climbing accident, but then became he's an avid rock climber. He became so devoted to continuing his activity in rock climbing that he designed new kinds of prosthetic legs, both for himself and now for others, new kinds of limbs. But the interesting thing about this particular picture is that the legs that he designed enabled him to do, he can mix and match different kinds of legs, and the legs that he's wearing in this photo enabled him to do a certain kind of climbing that he wasn't able to do before with his original legs. So he's designed, for example, feet that have a narrower kind of wedge shape or that have a better grip on ice. He says he can change his height at will, so he can walk around as a tall person or as a shorter person, depending on the length of the legs that he wants to wear. And these actuators are also part of the ecosystem of this technology, is the use of things like new kinds of interfaces, including brain-machine interfaces, to control them. And then the last technology that I would mention is maybe the most troubling, and certainly it's been reported on quite a bit in the news, but it involves what you might call biological, genomic, or chemical enhancement of certain kinds of proteins. The most famous example of this currently is the CRISPR technology for genetic editing, but that, of course, is not the end of the story. And we're going to see, I think, much more rapid development of these kinds of techniques. But they allow, in principle, and we've already seen this in some medical applications, they allow people to selectively edit certain parts of their genome, usually centered on particular regions of the body or organs. There's also much discussion of genomic alteration that could be passed on to offspring, but most of the current work sort of just focuses on changing the somatic genome. So it's not an issue of whether the genomic changes will be passed on to offspring. And of course, there are also things that are non-genomic, including pharmaceutical or chemical varieties of enhancement. These are all, as I say, they're very interesting. They're all rather troubling, but they're going to impact children's lives in, I believe, I think the specifics are very much fluid at this point. There are a lot of moving pieces in making predictions of this kind, but this general direction, which goes by the name of human augmentation or human extension, or more broadly, transhumanism, the idea of using technology to vastly expand the constraints and limitations of the human body and mind, I think are going to be extremely important for children's technology in the next quarter century and beyond. Now, that is sort of an overview of the technology side of what Platonius was writing about. We'll get back to that, but I also wanted to sort of talk about that other element of her quote. See, these are hobbyists who are doing this. These are amateurs. That phrase about going down to the garage, very telling. Anne and I have, for years now, sort of been, I would say, card-carrying members of, maybe not central members, but sympathetic members of what has been called the maker movement. There's a style of work that stresses the democratization of technology and the open use of new kinds of technologies for children, for hobbyists, for amateurs. These include, things that are associated with the maker movement, technologies that are associated with it, include things like the fabrication devices that I mentioned earlier, 3D printers, laser cutters, computer-controlled sewing machines and paper cutters and milling machines and so forth, along with microprocessors like the Arduino. It's a very ecumenical community. There are a lot of different styles melded within this community. I put up several representative books here. These are all, in a way, kind of manifestos for the maker movement, but if you read all three of them, you see that they come from very different points of view. Anderson's book is about a new kind of, as suggested, new kind of industrial revolution, going into business using the tools of, using these new personalized technological tools of the maker movement. Matthew Crawford's book is really about the psychological or philosophical aspects of a life in making as opposed to a life spent sort of, systematically avoiding the use of one's hands. And so he talks about, he received a PhD, I believe, in political philosophy, and then went on to become a motorcycle repair person. And he describes how much happier he is, and how much, in fact, more creative he can be in his work as a maker than he was able to be before. The bottom left book by Mark Frauenfelder is kind of a book about living off the grid, very different than Anderson's book. He talks about making one's own musical instruments and spoons, and he keeps chickens in the backyard. And so it's about self-sufficiency. Those are all aspects of the maker movement. They all show up at these maker fairs. If you've ever been to any one of them, they're really quite amazing and interesting. You see these various communities and styles coming together. The body modders that Platoni is talking about are, I think, clearly representative of a new sort of subculture within this community. That is to say, they are makers too. The kinds of technology that they're using to make is directed at their bodies. And that's new, and for the traditional, it's almost weird to say this, for the traditional maker community, I think it's still not quite on their radar, and I'm not sure they entirely know how to respond. There's a kind of natural fit between the maker community and the sort of people that Platoni was meeting with. I wanted to read, for example, this. Here's a quote from Dale Doherty, who's one of the most prominent figures of the maker movement, publisher of Make magazine, which is seen as the flagship magazine of the movement. And by the way, calling it a movement is itself maybe a little presumptuous. It's not my term, but broadly speaking, it includes not only Make magazine, but various DIY organizations, the Instructables website, the Thingiverse website. So there's a large community of people who are interested in appropriating this technology in a democratized way. And look at what Dale Doherty says. And this is a fairly recent essay. When I started, the essay, by the way, is called The Maker Mindset. When I started Make magazine, I recognized that makers were enthusiasts who played with technology to learn about it. A new technology presented an invitation to play, and makers regard this kind of play as highly satisfying. Makers give it a try. They take things apart, and they try to do things that even the manufacturer did not think of doing. So there's this rhetoric of fearlessness about this, of willingness to experiment. Now, if you take out the words the manufacturer and replace them with evolution, you have something of the idea of what Cara Platoni's body modders are thinking about. The manufacturer in this case is our bodily equipment. The opportunity of technology is to play with that. Makers often talk about things like, don't build with nails, build with screws, because screws can be undone and you can go on the inside and muck around with the machinery. This is effectively what these people are doing. In an even more, I don't know if you want to call it shocking or interesting way, notice the date on this it's teeny. December 24th, 2017. A couple of months ago, a few months ago. So this is Josiah Zahner, who is experimenting with CRISPR technology on himself. Maybe very unwise, maybe very dangerous, but it's certainly in keeping with the kind of mindset that Dale Doherty is talking about. The reason I think that this is so important for children's technology is because not only is there a natural fit between this sort of maker community and mindset and these new technologies that are emerging, but there's a natural fit between the attitudes of youth subcultures and self-experimentation. We already see it in a variety, we've seen it over time, and we continue to see it. So, occasionally I've spoken about this, and I've heard people say, well, kids would never experiment with this stuff, and I'm thinking, what kids have you known over the decades, you know? Like, of course they're going to preferentially experiment with this stuff. This is part of the same cultural matrix that has produced, tattooing, body piercing, cosplay, that's up in the upper left, goth communities. In the bottom center there is it's a kind of body modding. It's a surgical technique that allows people to get sort of pixie ears if they want them. So this is what young people do. They experiment with their appearance. They play with their identities. They're not as wedded to the idea of a fixed identity as in general as adults are. That's a statement that needs some citation and unpacking, but that can be done. I think that if anything, recent history has shown us, the last century of history of youth culture has shown us that there is a great willingness to experiment with available technologies at the risk of a certain amount of self-destruction, but also with the intent of, deciding what one's community is and who one's peers are and who one is. And this is, I think, going to be a more intense, poignant kind of set of technologies that are going to influence how young people think about themselves. The literature on this is not generally to be found. There are very interesting cognitive science and cognitive psychology questions about much of these technologies. But the source of literature on this kind of work, I think, is to be found in the literature of anthropology or sociology on youth cultures. And there's plenty of that. And I think it's telling when you read these sources about how a variety of technologies have been appropriated by young people's communities, how certain kinds of subcultures emerge, grow, sustain themselves, and sometimes die out. And I think we're going to see that writ large with the variety of technologies that I've been describing. To go back to the kind of body modder community that Platonia is talking about, it has the elements of I don't want to go into, I could go into a long detour about the description that she gives of this community in her book, but for now, suffice it to say that it reminds me a great deal of the communities of computer hackers in the benign sense, computer enthusiasts from the early years of computing, from the 1970s and 1980s. There's a book by Stephen Levy called Hackers, which describes that community in exquisite detail. And the people that Platonia is talking to are very much in that mold. they're sitting around the coffee table. They're going down to the garage. They go out for runs to Radio Shack or the local electronics store to gather themselves up some loot. They have their own in-jokes. They have their own, internal language. They have their own sort of common interests. It's very much like a self-contained community. And those are things that are, again, very familiar from the literature on anthropology of the young. This is one instance of it. We're going to see many instances probably derived around different technologies. For all I know, there may be a growing subcommunity around self-experimentation with CRISPR, much like the group that's going around with self-experimentation around sensory enhancement. There's also an echo here, and here I wouldn't, again, it may be too much of a detour to go into this in detail, but it's not just that this is a group interested in technology. When you read about this group, they have a philosophy of what they're doing. In some respects, they're reminiscent of the little utopian subcommunities that sprang up in America all through the 19th century. The Rappites and the Millerites and the Owenites and the Shakers. And if you go through the list of, if you go through a history of the 19th century, there were all of these smallish groups that gathered together to live in what they felt would be a utopian fashion. A couple of them survive, like the Mormons were a group that began this way in the 19th century. And many of them did not survive. But they're not to be belittled in retrospect, even if they didn't survive, because they were experimenting. They were trying new kinds of ways of living, involving all kinds of things that in retrospect we might think of as kind of odd, like, communal property or rules about where men and women are going to live in the village or things like that. But they were trying stuff. The same kind of image occurred to me when reading about these body modders. They're not only technology enthusiasts like the ham radio enthusiasts of the early 20th century, or the hot rodders of the middle years of the 20th century, they're also utopians. And they discuss the nature of the human boundaries and how to expand that. Our own interest, of course, is in kids' crafts and democratization of technology. And some of this, again, is going to be targeted at the body. At the left there, you see it's not an implanted tattoo, it's a kind of external tattoo, but it's very thin. It can be placed on the body. It's mainly used, I think this particular technology is used for kind of health monitoring. So you can do things like monitor your heart rate and blood pressure and so forth. But beyond that, it's also decorative. So this is a suggestion that the kind of things that the kind of activities that you saw in that earlier slide, kids putting on new kinds of costumes or new kinds of ear design or things like that, will morph into the uses of these technologies for self-decoration. The same folks who were working on implanting magnets have also implanted LEDs in their hands. It's still a little alarming to me. And there's Stellark again, who has an ear. This is actually, the ear was in part made with adult stem cells from his own body. So this is a flesh ear, at least partly flesh ear. And what he wants to do is implant sound sensors in it, or I think sensors so that you can talk to him, via the web from a long distance, and he'll be able to hear you and have a conversation back with you. Now, is this how to feel about this? We have Anne and I have a 17-year-old son. If he were to ask me if he could get an ear on his arm, I would tell him to wait till he's out of the house. But things that are weird, there's a distinction, of course, that we have to accommodate over time between things that are weird and disturbing and things that are wrong. And there's, try as I might, I can't see any particular reason why these things are wrong. They certainly do seem strange, but that's also a question of time frame. Things may seem far less strange to us. Different things might seem strange in another 30 or 40 years. There are other kinds of disturbing issues involved with this technology. Naturally, the things that come up include, well, I'll mention the second one first, that people often in discussions of this technology say that they're much more comfortable with technology as a means of restoration or therapy than they are as a means of enhancement. So, for example, they're fairly comfortable with the idea of making new and powerful prosthetic limbs to replace missing limbs, or cochlear implants, or things of that sort. But when it comes to enhancement, then there are new kinds of questions raised. I think this is a very hard distinction to maintain in practice when you start looking at the actual work that's being done. And I'll mention Hugh Harrigan. He's missing limbs. He designed prosthetic legs for himself. Those prosthetic legs enhance his performance relative to what he was able to do before. Should he have stopped at merely recovering the performance that he had before and not enhanced that performance? I don't find that a very easy argument to make. And in general, there seems to be a very permeable boundary between what we think of as restorative or therapeutic uses of these technologies and enhancement uses. So I don't, this feels like a distinction that we might want to make, but I don't think it's a very stable one. There are naturally questions as time evolves of who's going to have access to these technologies. Will there be equitable access? Will there be a fragmenting of society as people develop different kinds of bodily extensions? And these are not, I don't think they're slightly futuristic, but I don't think they're at all fanciful questions. They're realistic questions based on the state of technology that we see now, and they're certainly going to impact kids' lives. I also think that for our own interests, for Anne's and my interests and those of our students in children's learning and development and education, many of these technologies, for various reasons, might be not only preferentially voluntarily employed by young people, but they might be appropriate to young people. For example, for many of these exoskeletons or prosthetic limbs or new kinds of limbs, it takes a bit of practice and expertise to use them in a fluent way. It wouldn't be unexpected that starting kids early on such devices would enable them to work better with the devices than people who start at a later age. Analogous to what we all know from things like music education. People who want to play violin professionally usually begin their training at a young age because empirically over the years, and this is something that there's also a body of cognitive and psychological research about, but people who become expert in a variety of performance skills begin early to do that. So the use of new kinds of senses or actuators or things like that may in fact be more advantageous for young people than it is for older people. There's another side to this too, and this kind of relates to some of the troubling aspects of this that I feel, which is that my strong preference, apropos of the maker movement, is to keep these technologies democratized and available. There is naturally the thorny question of what happens with people like Josiah Zahner who experiment on themselves in ways that we might think of as dangerous. I find that, however, less troubling than the image of a kind of large-scale corporate takeover of these technologies, so that, for example, this has to do with whose purposes are being met, are being responded to by some of these technologies. I would be disappointed to see children's technology for enhancement be used simply to make them, for example, more attentive in classrooms, or to make them perform better on standardized tests. I don't entirely trust Elon Musk, despite his great success in launching a car into space. He's got this idea of, what does it say? The goal of human enhancement. You could read this whole thing. We're gonna, I don't trust his taste. So, your mileage may vary, but I don't want him to be the person defining how these technologies are used. I'd rather trust Josiah Zahner and his own self-experimentation than somebody deciding that there's a quality of megalomania about some of this work. But also, within the lives of children, there's a very recent, interesting book about the history of child prodigies by Ann Hulbert. Just came out a few weeks ago. And I think there are some dangers in the kinds of things that parents might do or elect to do in enhancing their children for various reasons. This is a very interesting book. It's an old book from the 80s, Developing Talent in Young People, edited by Benjamin Bloom. And it's filled with stories about very talented children and how they became, experts in the things that they do, whether it's sports or music. And it's filled with many stories about generally told in a kind of cheerful or benign way, about the support that they received from their parents in doing this. Like, the parents moved from a village to a city in order so that their very talented child could get music lessons from the best teacher, that kind of thing. There are somewhat less happy versions of this story, and I put up pictures here of the philosopher John Stuart Mill and the cyberneticist or early computer scientist Norbert Wiener, both of whom wrote autobiographies, both of whom had fathers who made a concerted effort to turn their sons into geniuses. And both were very messed up, let's just put it that way. They were, in fact, highly brilliant people. But their books are a reflection of the difficult adulthood that they had and the highly fraught relationships with their fathers that they had as a result of being turned into prodigies. Sometimes, again, when I'm talking to students about these technologies, the question comes up of would parents ever do this to their kids? And again, the answer is not many, probably not a whole lot. But if only a few do, then that can be a very destabilizing social phenomenon. So the question is not whether large numbers of people might do it. More and more people might be compelled into doing it because of the small number who enthusiastically elect to do it. This is the way in which technologies spread. I was going to talk about some other stuff, but I think what I'd like to do is finish by talking about some of the work that we are doing in this area. It's very it's early, and heuristically we're trying really the sort of gentlest introduction to dealing with some of these questions and designing technology for children. But we've been working on a couple of sort of bodily sensory extensions for children that can enable them to understand or empathize with the worlds as experienced. The term in old cognitive psychology was the Umwelt, the experienced world of animals. So one project involves a dog puppet named Cody, and inside this dog puppet, I'll show. By the way, the brilliant doctoral student who is working on Cody is here now, Nick Gagne, and if you want to get a demo of the puppet, he'll be here afterward to show it. But I think what I'll do just now is show you a couple of quick videos. So here, this is just, these are silent. So this is the engineering of Cody. You can see there's an ultrasound sensor, really a sound sensor capable of receiving high-pitched sounds in the ear. There's the embedded computation and power source, and the program running is doing a fast Fourier transform of incoming sound signals to look for sort of higher pitched sounds beyond those of human range, presumably not beyond the range of a dog. And there in the wrist is an array of actuators, motors, that can stimulate you in stimulate your wrist in different patterns depending on the pitch of the sound being received. So this is a little sort of handheld version of Eagleman's idea of expanding senses. And here's a teeny demo, but again, you can see, if you're interested, you can get a demo from Nick to show you how the thing works. But here, there's Nick holding Cody off in the background. He can't see me. I'm about to, at some point, I'm going to press a button that will emit a tone at 17,000 hertz, which is, it's within the hearing range of some younger people, certainly not for me. But when the button is pressed, then Cody responds by signaling Nick on his wrist so that he knows that there was a sound in the neighborhood. That's one example of the kind of thing we're doing, and another example is this is still a very early. We're not even quite at the prototype stage yet, but a whisker sensor that you can wear a helmet which will have an array of tactile stimulation at the forehead and strain sensors built into long whiskers so that you can walk around in the dark and feel objects around you. And again, there are specific patterns of stimulation that are going to be associated with specific patterns of stimulation. So, of whisker stimulation. So these are examples of, they're wearables, they're certainly not implanted, but they're touching on the larger subject of things that people might wear over time to expand their experience of the world. This is representative of our own interests in science education, of course, but we're also interested in pursuing this to issues of actuation and brain-machine interfaces and things of that sort. So we don't know exactly how, where the different projects will take us. For us, the interest is in expanding kids' intellectual, cognitive, experiential worlds. That's just one aspect of this. The impact of this technology, I think, is going to be quite profound, and especially profound on young people. And that, I think, is the subject of research in a variety of respects: cognitive, developmental, design, medical applications, and so forth. I think those are areas of research that are going to be quite active in the decades ahead, very likely from people in this community. that is in the cognitive science community. So with that, I'll finish up and say thank you. The work has been supported by NSF, and there's a whole variety of people that have been very influential on my thinking about this. They may disagree with any or all of what I said, but I'll finish up there and say thanks.
Questions, comments, observations? So Mike, last year we did a World